Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley McManus, Director of Marketing at Affectiva. Welcome to Affectiva Asks, a human-centric AI podcast, where each episode we feature thought leaders doing cutting-edge work in the AI space. A little bit about us. Affectiva is the pioneer of emotion AI, software that can detect nuanced human emotions, complex cognitive states, behaviors, activities, and interactions. And Affectiva is applying this technology to advance the next generation of multimodal in-cabin sensing, as well as optimizing brand content and media spend by measuring consumer emotional responses to videos, ads, and TV shows, unobtrusively and at scale. We have a special episode for you today featuring a number of guests from our CEO, Dr. Rana el Kaliouby's virtual book tour. What is a virtual book tour? So, she launched her book, Decoded, in April 2020 in the midst of the COVID pandemic. So all of her planned book promotional events and travel were rightfully canceled. Yet we wanted to make the most out of this by creating a standing virtual book tour, where every week, Rana live streams on her social profiles with some amazing guests. We've seen some lively conversations in these last few months, which have explored technology innovation, ethics in AI, advancing women in tech, and leadership. So for today's episode, I thought we could take a look back at some of the most memorable moments and guests from her book tour. It was not an easy selection. There were so many amazing discussions to choose from. I chose to focus on three people for today. So Dr. Bilal Zuberi, a partner at Lux Capital, who talked about what it means to be an immigrant entrepreneur. Then we have Dr. Carl Marcy, psychiatrist at Massachusetts General Hospital and assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, who discussed the intersection of mental health, empathy, and technology. And finally, Pam Koska, CEO of AllRaise, which is an organization with the mission to amplify female voices, accelerate their success, and create a tech culture where women are leading, shaping, and funding the future. She covers her personal experience as CEO and raising money as a woman. Again, these are just three of many amazing guests, so I encourage you to take a look at Rana's social profiles to see the latest interviews and to visit the Girl Decoded Virtual Book Tour YouTube playlist to see and listen to all of the featured guests and content. So let's kick off with this first snippet where Dr. Carl Marcy and Rana discuss the empathy crisis and social distancing and the effects of the pandemic on mental health.
Today, I'm very excited to welcome my guest, Dr. Carl Marcy. We are going to spend the next 45 minutes or so talking about mental health, which is front and center for all of us during this global pandemic, and the role that technology and empathy play with mental health in relationship to mental health. So Dr. Carl Marcy is a psychiatrist at Mass General Hospital. He's an assistant professor at the Harvard Medical School. He's also founder and CEO of Interscope, which was acquired by Nielsen several years ago. And he's currently a senior mental health advisor to Ready Responders and plays a number of roles, including being the chair and chief scientific advisor to Beyond Conflict. Carl and I think we met over 10 years ago at MIT Media Lab. We were trying to track down the very first time we met. But our universes have overlapped and we've crossed paths many times over the last few years. And we haven't quite pulled off a collaboration, right? But we aspire to. So again, very excited for this conversation to dig deep into what, the implications of this global pandemic on our mental health and our sense of, isolation and how do we feel connected and the role technology plays. So first of all, Carl, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me and greetings to your audience.
Thank you. So first of all, how are you doing? I know you have twins at home. How's that going?
Well, I think first we should just say we're blessed to be in a safe place and have food and be managing all this in a so far a healthy way. But I think like everyone, we're anxious, nervous about the future and dealing with a lot of uncertainty. And then of course, with three kids, I've got twins and then I've got a 7-year-old, dealing with virtual education in school is a challenge, particularly for my wife, who's just doing a terrific job trying to juggle all of it and be a teacher, a caregiver, a wife, and a mother all at the same time. So even people who are doing well on paper are struggling in this crisis. So, a lot of empathy for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have a very interesting kind of path where you've intersected medicine and technology quite a bit. So tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so I'm very fortunate to have a very windy path in my career. But I started off after medical school and doing my residency training in adult psychiatry, getting very interested in the patient-doctor relationship, right? So what is it about the relationship between a clinician and a patient that has healing power above and beyond medications, surgery, and laying on of hands? And there was a growing literature both in terms of psychotherapy, but also in the placebo research world where, giving people a sugar pill had outcomes comparable to an antidepressant. So if you look at the placebo response in the sort of 60s when the first antidepressants came out, it was in the, roughly in the 40 to 50 range percent wise. Over time, over the 3 decades or 4 decades or 5 decades, the placebo response actually got stronger. Right. So it goes up to like close to 60, in some cases 65%. How does a sugar pill get stronger? Right. Well, it doesn't. But what's changed is the nature of our clinical trials. They got more sophisticated. There were more, human to human contacts, a lot more check-ins and follow-ups. And so I developed this sort of idea in my head that, maybe there was a way in which the relationship, that people have, can generate healing power. And if so, and I think there was evidence the sexes did, how could that work? Right. So my academic idea was to try to understand from a brain and physiology perspective what the mechanism of two people connecting would be. And so that, ended me in a world where I was using a lot of physiologic sensors and cameras, and trying to behavioral code and understand at a deeper level, not just what people say, but what they're actually experiencing and how they connect with one another. And we ended up, finding some interesting correlations with patients' perceptions of empathy. So the more connected the patient felt to their clinician, the higher their physiologic, synchrony or concordance was, which was just really cool and exciting.
Yeah. Well, let's go there. So, my book, starts with, this proposition that we're living for an empathy crisis. And, I think, that's causing a lot of, not the only cause, but we're seeing a lot of polarization on social media platforms and just, this lack of empathy and lack of compassion for others. So tell us more about, and I'm just like super fascinated by the work you've done where you basically found that doctors who are more empathetic are less likely to get sued, right? Which I just find like really interesting. So say more about that.
Well, there's a number of interesting correlations with empathy in the clinical world, right? So if you look at just medical students, they actually their peak of empathy is the first year, and over time they actually get less and less empathic. And on the surface, that sounds terrible, and you can be cynical about that. But what actually happens is as medical students learn medicine and they go through their training, they're acquiring more and more knowledge. And so they're using part of their brain capacity to focus on a differential diagnosis, looking at symptoms, trying to understand pathophysiologically what's happening with the patient. And all that bandwidth is taking away from their other capacities that we really are sort of born with and develop over time. Its ability to listen and resonate with one another. So if you take it with that lens, it's not super surprising that empathy drops. Now, the consequence of that, of course, is that it's precisely what a lot of people need. So if empathy has healing power, then we have to figure out a way to train clinicians and train other people to really have this power. So one of my colleagues, Helen Reese, has been really innovative in creating a curriculum for clinicians to restore some of that empathic ability. And it turns out you can train doctors to be more empathic. So it's very exciting work.
So this is really interesting because I've been, especially during this pandemic, I've been really advocating for leading with empathy and empathetic leadership. And I love what you just said, like empathy has healing power. And I believe that that's true for a doctor, but it's also true for a leader, which we all are, right, in our communities and in our teams. Yeah, that is like very interesting.
Well, one of my pet peeves about this epidemic is this phrase, social distancing, right? It's a terrible phrase, right? It really should be physical distancing. The last thing anyone needs is social distancing. And if you think about, from a developmental perspective, right, at birth, humans, are born, with only 10% of their brain essentially developed, right? So 90% of brain development occurs after we're born. And if you think about it, you're a mother, right? So, it's going to be about 18 years or so before we let our children off in the world. That's an extraordinarily long time. So we're essentially wired to connect with one another, physiologically and neurobiologically. And it's a real need we have. And so the idea that, a virus can force us to socially distance, I think is actually wrong. What we need is physical distance from the contagion, of the viral particles, that we know are so concerning. But the last thing we need is to be socially isolated. I'll give you one other example I heard recently, which I think is, we can all relate to is, what do we do with prisoners who are really, really bad? We put them in solitary confinement.
Right.
Why? Because it's horrible, right? People get deprived of social contact, have all kinds of bad outcomes. And we know from the prison literature that actually it can have lasting effects. So I think the last thing we want is social distancing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we should definitely rename it to physical distancing, because I find that in my world, and that's true for a lot of people I interact with, we're all craving this human connection. You are continuing to see patients through all of this. What are you seeing? What are the effects of this pandemic on our mental health?
Yeah, well, they're extraordinary, right? I don't think anyone is untouched by this experience. And we talk a lot about flattening the curve of the rates of exposure and the diagnosis of the COVID, but also deaths, of course. But I think there's another curve we're going to have to work on, which is, flattening the curve of the mental health crisis that's happening. That's really going up. I'll tell you my experience with my clinical patients, many of whom I've seen for over 10 years, right? So these are people I know quite well. They're really falling into sort of three buckets, right? So the first bucket is exactly what you would expect. People who are anxious or more anxious. They're asking for more medications and they just really feel a little unhinged. And I think that's concerning, but not surprising clinically. The second bucket, I think, speaks to the resiliency in all of us, right? So, patients who are just like, we're going to get through this and here's what I'm doing. And they have meaning and purpose and they're really focused on either their family, or in many cases their work if they're essential workers, in supermarkets, or public transportation, right? We forget that these are also heroes who are out there putting food on our tables and keeping the transportation things moving. And then there's this third bucket, which I find the most interesting, which are patients who, have, social phobia or agoraphobia, which is sort of the fear of leaving. They have trouble getting up in the morning and getting out, and they've had that for years. They're feeling a little validated. And they're like, my life hasn't changed and you are welcome to the way I live and experience the world, right? And it's sort of fascinating to hear them, sound, healthier in an odd way because they feel like, well, now everyone can understand how I experience things, which I just found really interesting.
That is really interesting. Do you take different approaches with patients in these different buckets?
Well, I think we're all trying to figure that out. But yeah. I think you do, right? So certainly in bucket one, where people are in crisis, you try to do everything you can to sort of manage that. And so as a psychiatrist, I have some tools in terms of medication, but also in terms of just trying to give them the therapy and support they need to get through that. I think those who are in that second bucket, who are actually showing, I think, an amazing resiliency, which I think we all have inside of ourselves, is to validate that and give them that positive feedback. You're doing great. Like, keep it up, keep focused, keep doing what you're doing. And then those in the third bucket, I'm just sort of wondering out loud with and saying, well, what is it like to have people now experiencing something that you had trouble articulating and couldn't understand? Literally yesterday in clinic over the phone, I had a patient say, I used to feel guilty about not being able to leave the house, and now I don't have that because I can't.
That's so interesting. And in a way, and I'm seeing a comment from Jordan. Hi, Jordan. Jordan says, this pandemic increases people's capacity for empathy. And I'm like, welcome to my world, right? And I think that is really interesting how this pandemic in a weird way is creating more empathy for folks who go through mental health issues, and right?
Yeah, and I like to build on that. I was thinking about this, and some other forums have commented. What an extraordinary opportunity we all have to destigmatize mental illness, and just reflect on this for a minute, right? So we're all experiencing, the sort of obsessive thinking about, did I get contact with someone who has a virus, or when I go shopping for food, did I touch something, right? And we're all compulsively washing our hands. Well, that starts to feel a little like OCD, right? And we're all sort of feeling that ever-present threat, right? Like, ooh, there's just something out there that could get us, right? That begins to feel a little like PTSD.
Yeah.
We're all experiencing social isolation to some degree, right? And just like you said, it feels, there's just days where you just can't get your energy up and you can't get motivated and you can't move. Well, that starts to look a lot like significant or severe depression. And then finally, if there's a word that I've heard and used myself, the one word to describe this whole experience, it's surreal, right? There's a way in which like time and space have just been completely fractured. Well, guess what? That starts to look like schizophrenia, right? So I think there's a way in which we all can just sort of take a moment and say, there are people, this is their lived experience all the time. And we shun them and we ignore them and we try to, sometimes blame them for their character not being able to get over it and not realizing this is a brain disorder. And I hope one of the outputs of this tremendous crisis is that we can all kind of relate to one another in a more, like you said, more empathic way. You want to talk about technology?
Yeah, let's talk about technology.
Yeah, so you're in this amazing space, right? I've admired your work and we've used Affectiva's product off and on over time, right? So you use computer vision to capture people's facial expressions, right? So when you think about a post-COVID world, like what are the kind of applications you think about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting time for our technology because now, we've been advocating for years, and kind of saying, our communication is mediated by technology and we need to really think about how technology affects that communication, the quality of it. As we continue to work virtually and connect virtually and learn virtually, I think there's a huge opportunity for our technology, and most relevant, I guess, to our conversation here is I think there's a huge opportunity in mental health. We know that there are facial and vocal biomarkers of things like stress and anxiety and depression and even suicidal intent, Parkinson's, autism. And we're all stuck in front of our devices for better or worse for many hours of the day. So could that, what if that provided an opportunity to capture your mental health, learn your baseline over time, and then as you start to deviate from that, it could, flag that to you, to a family member, to a clinician or a psychiatrist. So I'm really intrigued by the applications in mental health, and I'm curious what you think because you've looked into that space as well.
Yeah. And I think we're on the same wavelength, right? So, what an opportunity to take, millions of people sitting in front of a camera, interacting with other people, to use technology to empower that. Look, I think that, you mentioned the empathy crisis, which, I think some people would argue predated COVID. And as technology has invaded our world more and more, particularly smartphones, and we use them more and more, people have argued, and I think there's pretty good evidence that it's starting to interfere with our ability to connect with one another. And I think part of the reason for that is that, the technology got ahead of our goals, right? So instead of us reacting to products and technology, it really should be products and technologies reacting, to our needs. Right. So we need to think about how technology can empower us, not break us down. Right. Yeah. So how can we turn the table on that and say, okay, well, instead of decreasing empathy, how can we use various technologies like emotional capture through computer vision to give feedback to make people more empathic? I think that's super exciting. And as we change our work environment, why not try to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So my mantra in the book and in my work is to humanize technology before it dehumanizes us. And I think the approach is very much what you said. That's funny. the approach is to take a very human-centric approach to how we think about these AI and technology in general and how we kind of develop and deploy them. With empathy, I am just like super intrigued and dying to explore what if we could build an empathy detector, right? Like you and I are, we've got our 2 video feeds right now. What if we were able to capture our facial expressions and kind of lay them out and look at the synchronicity, and kind of build some concept of empathy? I mean, in your patient, relationships, how do you think empathy manifests? Like, what does it look like?
Well, the one of the big takeaways from my research was that it's very hard to be empathic when you're talking. So one of the things we found is that therapists who talk a lot and don't listen tend to have fewer synchronous moments. And if you think about it, right, as we're talking, as I'm talking now, I'm thinking about what I'm saying at some level, and I'm focused more on what I'm communicating rather than watching your response to that. So I think, simple things like that, which is just, how much, are you, listening versus talking, right? I think the other thing that you might see is that, when people are in synchronous moments, they do things like nod their head at the same time, right? Or smile at the same time, right? I think we would have high levels of empathy right now. Because we're sharing ideas and our brains are resonating in a particular way. And I think, that's what gets a lot of people excited. But it's been very hard to measure. It's mostly only been measured in the lab. How do you begin to think about doing that at scale? So that we can all sort of get a better sense for how connected we are. I mean, look, I think this is one of the potential takeaways from this whole crisis is that, we're all human. We all have vulnerabilities and we're all experiencing, a common, threat. And that, historically has brought people together. I think the challenge is we're in a very polarized, world. You mentioned at the top of the hour my relationship with Beyond Conflict, where I'm chair and chief science advisor. And we've got a report coming out in the next, few weeks, that looks at the level of political polarization. And one of the things we found is that, people's perceptions of how polarized they are relative to the other party turn out not to be accurate. They're far more extreme than the reality of how people perceive them. Yeah. So I think there's some hopeful signs, if we frame questions using the good science and perspective of different people, that we can kind of, begin to build on this shared experience, and try to come together a little bit more rather than further apart.
Again, back to like this moment in time where, we are all interacting virtually, including telehealth. I mean, telehealth has suddenly, like, all of these hospitals and clinics that have been debating whether we should do telehealth, they're all now using telehealth, right?
Yep.
But that's not the only way you can communicate with your patient, right? You can communicate by text, by phone. Do you have a sense of what's more effective or what works better?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? So, I was literally on a call earlier this week where, we're evaluating, different, text-based therapies, right? Where it's a human to human, but instead of phone and instead of videography, right? You're just going through text. And, they have some very good outcomes. And I asked, this question, I was like, well, why do you think it's, potentially better than, face to face? And she said, well, we think that it's because, people can fantasize about who's on the other side rather than have the reality of who's there. And in, psychotherapy, literature, that's a type of idealizing transference, it's called, right? You sort of transfer your fantasies about this, hopefully, all powerful therapist to them. I think that remains to be seen. I do know there's some research on voice versus video, right? So video with voice or voice alone. And it turns out, voice alone can be very powerful, and that you get, 90% of, the experience or what's needed to understand, a lot of the emotionality through voice. So I think voice is another underestimated channel. And you and I have talked about this, right? So how can you combine, computer vision and voice feature analysis and some of these, non-verbal channels, to look at, how people are actually behaving rather than just what they say. I mean, one of the things we talk a lot about at Beyond Conflict, right, is it's we have to get past, thinking about what people think and think about how they think. And I think that can really be transformative.
I thought it was really interesting how Dr. Marcy categorized people into 3 buckets of patients. The whole conversation was such an interesting and timely discussion, and I hope you found some value out of that snippet. So next up, we have Pam Koska of Allraise talking about women leadership with Rana.
As you may know by now, so much of my journey was marked by my identity, in particular being a woman in a male-dominated tech industry. And as a result, I'm super passionate, and I'm a passionate advocate for diversity in technology, because I firmly believe that the more diversity we have around the table, the better the technologies that we design are going to be. We all have a variety of blind spots, and we design for what we know. So the more diversity we have, the more creativity and innovation we will get. And so I am super excited to have Pam Koska joining me today. She is a multiple-time CEO, and she's now the CEO of Allraise, a nonprofit organization on a mission to bring diversity to the tech industry, and in particular support female founders and female investors and funders. Last fall, Allraise started a Boston chapter, and I remember getting a call from Pam, and she shared with me the mission for Allraise and invited me to join the steering committee for the Boston chapter. And I remember saying, Pam, I think I should say no because I'm really busy with the book and Affectiva, but the mission just resonated so much with me. And I feel very grateful to be part of that community. And I've learned a lot, and it's just been a wonderful part. It's been wonderful to play part of Allraise's mission. So Pam, thanks for joining us today. Tell us a little bit more about Allraise. You have been there for just over a year.
Yes. Well, thank you for having me today. It's my pleasure to be here and to talk to you and to the audience. And we're so glad to have your voice in the Allraise community as well. So it has been a year since I joined, although Allraise has been around since technically late 2017. It came out of basically the Me Too movement that happened in Silicon Valley at that time. And about 30 plus women in venture and some female founders, notable and iconic female founders, got together and said, we think this is the time for change. We've all experienced in our careers what it means to be a woman in a very male dominated industry. And it's time for a new normal, a new version of visionary, as we like to say. And so from that, the organization was born. And one of our principles is that we are really trying to rewire the tech industry from the inside. Mm-hmm. And to take people who have power and influence. And one of the core cultural values we have is that power and influence should be shared out with other people with power and influence, and specifically, and to create that new infrastructure of power and influence. And so specifically, that means to approach people who've traditionally been viewed as outsiders to the kind of the Caucasian male insider, kind of homogeneity that exists in tech industry today. So we launched in 2017. We've been moving aggressively forward ever since with a dual focus on female founders and female investors as well. And we believe that the dual focus of that, well, it kind of breaks a kind of startup ethos of focus on one. We believe that the most traction that we will get in seeding a new flywheel, if you will, within the industry is by focusing on moving both dials simultaneously for the maximum impact.
I love the dual support, and I think it's really important to kind of cover all aspects of the ecosystem. So in my book, I talk about my personal experience raising money as a female founder. Over 10 years ago, Ross Picard, who's an MIT professor and my co-founder, and I did the Sand Hill Roadshow. So we flew out to the Bay Area. We had a whole bunch of investor meeting lined up. And I remember we literally had 0 meetings with any female investors. It was all your typical white, older white guy kind of investment community. And to make things worse, or more challenging, here we were, 2 women coming out of academia. I wore a hijab, so I was clearly Muslim at the time. And we were pitching an emotion company. So we would avoid the E word at any cost. We would dance around it, but never name it. And so we must have been so different and alien to what these investors were used to. Now we persisted. We've raised over $53 million of venture and strategic funding. But even like 18 months ago, our most recent round, again, it's pretty dismal, like very, very few female partners. This time around, I was more adamant to bring in investors that kind of cared about diversity. So we brought in Trend Forward Capital and Motley Fool Ventures, and they both have amazing female partners who are very involved and empowered. But it's not the norm. So can you say a little bit about the numbers, like how much funding is going to female founders, and what is All Raised and the community doing about it?
One of the things that we did when we started was to focus on data, because we think data is power. And by shining a light on where the industry is, we can hold ourselves as an organization accountable, and we can hold the industry at large. And that's not to say that when we report the numbers, the danger is that people think like we claim success for every progress forward or failure for every step back. But we really are just trying to report the numbers in many ways, and then obviously tailor our impact to have the best drive towards those. But when it comes to venture funding, it's not surprising to me that you have the experience you had. We just updated our numbers. 68% of venture capital firms still don't have a single female partner. So the odds of you walking in and finding somebody are still pretty low. You have to be intentional about doing that. And we think that's an important part of like how we organize our community too, is that founders have a voice in this. Founders are the oxygen or the lifeblood of the venture community. And so when you vote with who, when you have an option, because we realize that all founders don't always have an option, but when you have an option to take a term sheet from a firm that has diversified, we think that's going to be a benefit to you. And then you vote in that way as well, with who's in your cap table. And already that's starting to change kind of what we call this flywheel of where the economics go. But we do see light spots. When we started, 9% of check writers, we say people who can write an independent check and sit on a board, investing authority, if you will. So only 9% of check writers were women. Today, that's raised up to 12%. So we are we've made some progress forward. And yet we also look at 68% of firms still don't have a single female check writer. But we are seeing forward progress. Those who have invested and hired and engaged with general partners who are women are now seeing the benefits of doing so, right? And so we're seeing not just one, not the token female at the table, but we're seeing multiple women now at the table. And from some firms that we didn't necessarily think that would happen from. So that's the good news. And last year, we saw 54 new partners or GPs who were women, which was a record for the industry. So we're super excited about that. We clearly have some concerns going forward with what we call preventing the backslide. So we don't want to see that these women in a downturn are the first people to be let go, for example. So we're very cognizant of that fact. On the female founding side, there's been less progress, and that's been super frustrating. So in 2018, it was about 11.3%, I believe, went to female founders. And so we take a broader lens. There's lots of numbers out there. There's female founder only, female founder CEO only, and just a female founder. She could be a chief product officer. She could be the COO, the president, the CEO. It doesn't matter what role she has. We take that broader lens because we believe it's the diversity of the team that brings the value. So as long as she's on the founding team and has a major percentage in the cap table from an equity position, that's where we look and measure. So 11.3% in 2018, only up to 11.8%. So half a percentage point movement. And those are, if we look back, two of the most historically largest years in venture capital for dollars deployed. That's just paltry movement forward. We need to do better. And that's a choice of focus. And there's a couple of things that we believe are driving that, and we're picking at it, but we want to keep the focus on the fact that we need to be giving more money to women and underrepresented women in particular, because they're especially well hit. And then when we kind of talk about impact going forward, that's another area of concern where we're like, okay, if all we could do is 11.8% or in the last year, we need to do better. But I also believe that there's an opportunity to do better as we move forward.
So of the VC firms that have female partners, do we have any evidence that they are investing more in female founders or female-led companies?
We're always careful to say that, you can't draw the one-to-one corollary and analogy, because we're not trying to create the inverse of women invest in women. Right. What we do believe happens, though, is that the lens opens up at the venture firm. And the lens opens up in many ways. Their ability to understand different ideas that are brought to them that are not in their core experience set. The lens of the networks that are available to approach the company and the founders that are willing to come in. All of that opens up. And so we find that even men at venture firms that have women in them are more likely to invest in women. So it's not just women investing in women. It's really benefiting from the diversity that you spoke of. It happens on the foundry side and companies and the types of companies that are built and the way the products are built with a broader lens. Same thing happens on the venture side.
So I want to switch to what things we can do to affect change. But before we go there, can you share your own personal experience becoming a CEO?
Yeah. So my personal experience, I started in Silicon Valley as a product manager, kind of rose up in the marketing ranks to take over all of marketing, had some stints in sales as well. So I had a pretty rounded, broad background, and joined a company where I had said to the CEO, I'd worked with him before, and I said, sure, I'll come be the CMO one more time, but I kind of want to be in the passenger seat. I want to really be trained to be a CEO because that's what I want to do. And he very graciously said yes. A long story short, he ended up leaving the organization for health reasons. And that was kind of a crisis point for the organization. What were we going to do? Who were we going to be? How were we going to move forward? And the board suggested that we move into a sale for the company and it felt like there wasn't somebody in the organization who could be the CEO, although I was kind of like, I was leaning in, I want to do it. And they appointed, the founder was still there, and they made him the founder CEO. And he just really wasn't comfortable going through a sales process. And so he said, I just don't want to be the face of the company. Pam can be the face of the company. She's really good at this. And so I basically ran the M&A process for the company. It was a great exit for the organization, in all honesty. And the board came at the closing dinner, when you do the celebration of the acquisition, they came and they said oh, we got it wrong. Turns out that you could have been the CEO of the organization, which was really kind of a moment of frustration of what kind of bias had been there, or what kind of lack of visibility had been there. And I had been in board meetings with these people. It wasn't like they didn't know me. So it was kind of an interesting, inflection point. And despite that, I still did a tour after that of venture capitalists that I knew and had been on boards with, and basically said, I want to be a CEO. Would you hire me as a CEO? Would you put me in one of your portfolio companies as a CEO? And about the fifth one of the men that I knew really well just said, Pam, I got to pull you aside and tell you, don't ask this question anymore. Yes, we would, and stop asking this question. You don't have to ask permission to be a CEO. You're qualified, you're eminently qualified to do it. And men wouldn't be doing this. And it was a real learning point for me, just in terms of, how much of my questions were because of my previous experience. Had I just been taught that I needed to ask permission because I'd leaned in, I'd said yes, and people didn't take me up on it. So I think that there's a lot of learned behavior from that, not just for me, but for other women, where I think we're told a lot that we have to be better, more qualified. We have to prove ourselves more to overcome a lot of the unconscious bias that exists in the industry. Yeah. And as a result of that, we have to be better prepared, more prepared than the average person. And so that's one of the things I would personally love the industry to break itself of, is that a woman she's eminently qualified already, and not holding ourselves back from taking steps forward or trying for something because the industry pushes on us in a different way.
Yeah, I have a very similar experience. When we started the company, Roz and I decided to hire a kind of a seasoned business executive to run the company. And then he left after a few years. And the question was, okay, who's going to be the next CEO? And a few board members actually said Rana should, because it's her baby, it's her technology. And I had all these like inner doubts that, I'm not qualified. Like, what if I take the CEO seat and then, the company's not successful? And so I didn't raise my hand. But at the same time, our head of sales at the time, who had never been CEO either, he said, sure, I'll do it. And so he became CEO for a couple of years. And 2 years into that, I kind of just mustered all the courage I had. And I had to it was like a mind kind of reframing for myself, realizing that like you, I was doing all the I was raising money for the company. I was the face of the company. I was very intimately kind of familiar with the technology. And so I had to first convince myself. And then once I did that, it was a lot easier to bring the board and my team kind of on board with that. And my biggest learning from that was, there are already a lot of obstacles for women to overcome. Don't be your own biggest obstacle in a way.
So important. It's such an important lesson. Because once I turned that corner, I was like, well, now I'm the CEO. I'm not going back, right? There's just there's a difference in the approach. And I think it's true for anybody. If you're looking, should I apply for that job? Apply for the job. Like you don't have 100% of the criteria. Nobody has 100% of the criteria. Nobody's a perfect fit for that. And so don't hold yourself back from doing something. At least lean in. My experience was a little bit bad because I leaned in and then nobody took me up on it. But nothing ventured, nothing gained. And so there's enough obstacles out there, to your point. Don't be another one. Don't raise the bar even higher because you're not even you're presenting your own first obstacle.
So can we talk about the role of the network versus kind of working hard? To your point, women just to solve this, we're just working harder and harder and harder. But there's also a role for the network, right?
Absolutely. There's working hard. One of my favorite quotes that Telly Whitney, who was the former CEO of Anita Borg, would say, it's not what you know. It's not who you know, but who knows what you know, right? So there's this magical, you have to be good and competent at your job. You are that. But you have to get out there and meet people. And so networks are so important. And one of the things that we try to work on at Allraise is accessibility to networks. We realize that a lot of networks are closed off. Mm-hmm. But it is also true that studies will show that women are much more likely to, because we have so many responsibilities, because we have home responsibilities, job responsibilities, but we have a tendency to just put our heads down and work really hard. And if I do a really good job, they'll find me and my expertise will shine through. And I think if we look at how it works today, that's not necessarily true. It is as much about who you know and who knows you as it is what you're capable of doing. And so get out there and network. Get out there when it's 5 o'clock and you could do one more hour on your project, or you could go to that meetup or that cocktail hour. Go to the cocktail hour. Go to the meetup. Go have those networks. And if you're feeling awkward about that, come to organizations like Allraise and other places where we will facilitate that access, because we do realize that, again, it's not like my experience. Sometimes you lean in and there's nothing there. So we want to make sure that we're also breaking down networks. And, whether you're going to be a founder, you don't want to be having that first relationship or first conversation with someone when you're asking them for money, right? Build a relationship with them beforehand. Go meet, it's who's going to be your VP of sales. You're going to be talking. You want people who are VPs of sales in your network long before you need them. And so you want to be building this relationship long before you have to ask for something from that relationship. So it's just so important to get out there. knowledge is, and competency is a requirement, but not the only thing to do. And so it does frustrate me to hear sometimes that we spend a lot of time, and this is especially true when women want board seats, we spend a lot of time training ourselves how to be board ready. But men don't do that. I love organizations like Athena Alliance and Boardless because they are providing an invaluable service. You want to know how to be the best you can be when you're there. But men don't do that. They kind of learn on the fly. And we are perfectly capable and equally capable of on-the-job training to do something. So it is more about making sure you have access to the opportunities as they arise and that your internal monologue doesn't tell you to walk away from that. Or if it does, you just push past that internal monologue.
Right. So let's talk about the role of men in all of this. I know always kind of, we bring in male allies to be part of the community. So what's your take on that?
Male allies are so important to everything that we do. We're not, at All Raise, we always say we're not going to change. First of all, we're not building the mirror image. We're not building like, hey, let's make this a woman-driven thing as opposed to men. So we're very cautious about that. Men hold the power and influence. And what we want to say right now is like, there's a sharing of that power and influence. And all the economics of diversity show that the sharing of power and influence with diversity will create a bigger pie, not a reslicing of the pie. So anybody who's sitting there worried about like, ooh, I'm about to lose something, that's not true. The pie is going to get bigger. Love that Morgan Stanley, I think it was last year, came out with $4.4 trillion worth of value can be created from, investing in diversity, whether that's investing in more diverse founders, whether that's building more diverse teams. $4.4 trillion can be unlocked. That is, larger than the California economy. And we're like the 5th largest economy in the world. So there's a lot of value that can be had in there. Many women that I speak with will always point to there was somebody, a mentor, both male and female, but largely male because it is a male-dominated environment, that opened doors, that created opportunities, building on that networking, created opportunities for them. So it's super important for us to do that. We get asked all the time, I certainly do, I'm sure you do, how can I help?
Right.
Sometimes that's just a question like, how are you today? There's not a genuineness behind it. But most of the time there is a genuineness behind that. And what I say to male allies is there are small actions you can take, the daily actions that you can take, and there are bigger actions that you can take. And so engaging in those smaller actions daily to kind of overcome mansplaining that's happening, or manels is another one. We say just refuse to
manels, right?
A manel. We're seeing a lot of manels right now. Where I always say just say no. Just like, hey, just ask the question. Are there any women that are going to be on this panel? I really don't feel comfortable being on a panel without there being a woman on the panel. Are there any underrepresented individuals on the panel? I don't feel comfortable not being on a panel. The next step further from that is like, if they say no, say, well, I know a great person. Would you like, I'd be happy to do this if you also allow Rana to come to the panel, right? Like have Rana on the panel too. And so we're looking for those types of activities. And we believe that in the community, it's so important. The community is growing and there are many men who care about making this change and affecting this change. And it's one of choice. It's one of focus. And it's also one of unifying collectively the community around it. And so they're important voices, integral to the process. I'm sure you could speak about amazing women who have sponsored you and supported you and created opportunity for you from, early in your career to the board members you have today.
Yeah. And one person in particular, I want to give a shout out to Andy Palmer. He was Affectiva's first advisor. So I met with him over 10 years ago, and he's just been a phenomenal mentor and advisor, and, a great supporter of female founders. I think he coaches and mentors, a lot of the female founders in the Boston area. And it's just wonderful to have that relationship where it's safe. And, he cares both about kind of my professional growth, but also my personal well-being. And I think that's been wonderful to have an ally like that and a mentor like that. We need more Andys for sure.
Yeah. So any men out there who are listening today, email me at All Raise. reach out to somebody in your network. If you don't have a network, make it an objective this year. I'm a big person that believes in OKRs, and what we don't measure, we won't achieve. So if you set it as an objective to meet 5 new women, or to sponsor or mentor a woman or an underrepresented founder, then it will happen if you put it down as a measure, a metric that you want to drive towards.
I loved how Pam brought up the power of network and the quote, "It's not what or who you know, but who knows what you know." It's such a great point and super important to remember. Finally, we have Dr. Bilal Zuberi, partner at Lux Capital, who shared his background and immigrant story with Rana, how he became an entrepreneur and an investor.
So my guest today is a dear friend, Bilal Zuberi. He is a partner at Lux Capital. And he is passionate about all things deep tech. He was previously an investor at General Catalyst Partners. And actually, before becoming an investor, he sat on the other side of the table. He was an entrepreneur and co-founded Geo2 Technologies. Earlier in his career, Bilal was a strategy consultant at BCG, and he has a PhD from MIT. Bilal and I think, Bilal, we met, probably about 8 or 9 years ago. I had just started Affectiva, and our universes have overlapped and intersected over the years. So it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
It's awesome to be here, and good to see you, and good to see the book behind you. Looks good.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. So we thought the conversation today, which is a big theme in the book, but of course my story and Bilal's as well, the role of the immigrant entrepreneur and American values. What are the American values, and what is the role that we play as immigrant entrepreneurs in this country? So I thought I'd kick it off by sharing my story, and then Bilal, I'll ask you to share your story too. If you don't know my story, I'm Egyptian American. I was born in Cairo and grew up around the Middle East. Both my parents are technologists, and they had the opportunity to work first in Kuwait until the first Gulf War, and then we had to evacuate, and eventually ended up in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, where I finished school. And then over time, I studied computer science at the American University in Cairo, made my way to Cambridge University for my PhD, and ended up at MIT Media Lab as a postdoc before starting Affectiva. And I remember just the process of going through all of the different visas. For example, I came here initially on a J1 visa, which is the researcher visa. And when I was starting Affectiva, I had to kind of switch visa statuses, and I applied for the O1, which is the extraordinary alien visa. To that, till today, I picture this one-eyed green monster. But we've been in this country on and off for 10 years, but full time for the last 7 or so years. And my kids, they identify as Egyptian American. We call America home. And I just feel very, very lucky to be in this country and all of the opportunities it affords me personally, and it affords my family and my company. And so, I think a lot about what does it mean to be an immigrant and how to reconcile my Egyptian identity with my American identity. And I thought it would be fun to have an open conversation around this. So over to you. I think you have a really interesting story as well. So where did you grow up?
First, thank you for inviting me. Immigrant story. What is an immigrant? I think that's interesting to address it up front, right? An immigrant is somebody who came to this country from the outside. And I like to always add, in pursuit of a better life.
Yeah.
Whether you're escaping from real hardship, or you're educating yourself here, or you're finding a job here, regardless, the important thing is that you saw America as a land of opportunities, and you came here for that. So my story, I grew up I'm a Pakistani American, the famous hyphenated Americans that, so many of us are. My children are Pakistani Palestinian Americans. So
right.
Americans have 2 different hyphens because my wife is Palestinian American. I grew up in a lower middle class family, and I have no business being here from the economic conditions in which I grew up. But I was good at studies, and I did well in my studies in back in Pakistan. And the great American education system provided me with full scholarship to come out to the U.S. And honestly, it is amazing how many people I meet who only could come to this country because they were provided the educational scholarships to be here. And what an amazing thing.
Did you come to this country thinking you'd stay?
That I would stay?
Stay? Yeah.
No, of course not. I mean, the idea was that you come here for 4 years, you get a degree, you go back, and then you make a good living because you're, Western educated. You've done well. I actually, the story that most people don't know, at least some people would know, is, growing up, my father was an entrepreneur, but not sort of the tech entrepreneurs, ordinary entrepreneur. And I love ordinary entrepreneurs because really they're driving the economy of this country, if you think about it, and anywhere else in the world, frankly. Anyway, he, when I was coming here, I had no idea what I wanted to study. But he said, Bilal, if you figure out how to make toothpaste, we can build a toothpaste factory and sell. And at that time in Pakistan, we didn't have a lot of good toothpaste. Import export was not exactly easy and cheap. And most people were still using powder that you would rub on your teeth. And we're like, there's a great opportunity. So I came here, and alongside other courses, I decided, wait, let me major in chemistry and I'll learn how to make toothpaste. Well, the problem is that, in the chemistry majors in American universities, they don't actually teach you how to make toothpaste.
They don't?
They don't teach you how to make anything. Really. So here I am at the end of my undergrad. I mean, I was able to finish it in 3 years, and now I don't know how to make toothpaste. But my undergrad advisor comes to me and says, you're applying for grad school, right? I said, dude, I could barely afford to be an undergrad. There's no way I can afford. I need to go make a living because my parents are not really making any money. And he says, but they pay you. I'm like, what do you mean they pay you? And they said, well, National Science Foundation and NIH and others, depending on the field you study, there are graduate scholarships that pay you $1,000 to $2,000 a month as a stipend. And I was like, sign me up. What do you need to do?
That's a great deal, right?
It's again amazing that we have valued education in the past in this country in a way that has truly been our differentiator and our secret weapon. And I think something to be talked about, that we need to do more of that. And I think that very particular foundation is under threat. Anyways, I ended up going to grad school. I went to a small liberal arts school for undergrad. I went to a major engineering university, MIT, for my grad school. I did my PhD there. And you have
a really cool story about that, though.
Well, I think you're remembering, how I ended up choosing my advisor. So here I am from a small liberal arts college, studying chemistry and, coming out, going to the school and knowing that everybody there is coming from Caltech and UC Berkeley and Stanford and Harvard. And I'm like, geez, so I said, you have to choose a PhD advisor, right? And I said, let me find in these, all these faculty members, they're like so prominent scientists. They're on advisory committees of presidents around the world and they have all these awards. There was this one guy, with a Mexican sounding name, Mario Molina. He looked like he was, 40, 45 in the photo, at least. That this is, I'm an old guy. So, web was very new at that time. So he had a very simple page up that I think MIT had put up. And he didn't have very many awards, right? And he was doing atmospheric chemistry. And I said, I need to go work for him because unlike all these other really famous people, this guy's going to give me time and I want to learn. I want to spend time with him. So I choose him and, and I write to him. And I said, I would love to join your group. And are there academic papers of yours that you can send me, preprints or prints? And he writes back, says, hey, I'm not very good with this World Wide Web stuff. But somebody has put up a website where they have a few of my papers you can download. And he sends me this link to www.nobel.se/blah, blah, 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 blah. What the heck? So I click on it and I go there and I'm like, bang my head because this guy, this is 1998. In 1995, he got the Nobel Prize in chemistry. Okay. I was just shocked. I was like, oh my God. Like I wanted somebody who was, not as accomplished yet, who will have time for me. And here I find the only Nobel laureate in the chemistry department. But what a lovely ride with him. I spent 5 years at MIT. We closely collaborated, worked very close. We spent months in Mexico City ourselves together, researching the environment. And frankly, through him, I learned, what it means to have a responsibility as a scientist. And why I am doing what I'm doing, because in some ways he encouraged me that, you can be a professor or academic if you want to be, but, I know your type and, he and I commiserated that we feel this weight on our shoulders, that there's a lot more to do. I always call myself, pardon my French, the lucky, guy out of, population of 120 million, 180 million now, that got away. Right? Like there's many, many, many more people who are just as smart as I am, who are just as motivated as I am. And I just got lucky that I got an opportunity to be out here. So I owe something to that broader population that goes above and beyond having a job and a house and a wife and a dog and the American dream. I think there's a motivation to do something for others, and there's a motivation to accomplish something that goes above myself. And I think that's true for a lot of entrepreneurs. I think it drives entrepreneurs because in some ways we all know that we got the lucky lottery. Right? We all know that there's, yeah, sure, I worked hard, sure. But, I'm sure you did, right? But there's many people we know in other parts of the world who work just as hard or harder, have much more difficult circumstances than we ever did, and just as blessed in many other ways with intelligence and smartness and so on. But they don't get this opportunity. So we know we got the lucky lottery, and we got to make something of it, not only for ourselves, but for others as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I always tell my kids, we're very privileged, but privilege comes with a responsibility, right? And there's a we all have a responsibility to pay it forward and have a broader impact. So tell us quickly, how did you end up as an entrepreneur and then an investor?
I got a job at BCG. So I wanted to not become an academic. I decided that in my 4th year, I'm not becoming an academic. So what do you do when you're doing a PhD in chemistry? Well, it turns out you can either go for a pharmaceutical company, a chemicals company, or if you don't like those companies, then you're out of luck. I had to invent something for myself. And I realized that, hey, there are these management consulting companies that hire PhDs. Because they value your analytic capabilities and so on. So I ended up joining BCG. And a few months into it, realized that that's not what I want to do for the rest of my life. Making slides. I mean, it was a great learning experience. Don't get me wrong, but I wanted to be in on the action. I didn't want to be telling other people what to do and just walking away, which is kind of hilarious that I'm a VC now. But I came across a very interesting idea. Myself and a senior partner from BCG, we sort of took it on as a pro bono case for BCG to help them figure out the business. The scientists that had developed something, and we ended up building a business plan, an IP plan, and the whole thing for him. And they turned around and they said, you guys know this business way better than I do. Join us. And we both took the jump together. We both became co-founders and started this company. So I became an entrepreneur. The most important thing for me at that point in becoming an entrepreneur and making that decision was, 2 factors that I think a lot of immigrant entrepreneurs think about. One is, what do I have to lose? Right? The proverbial burning the bridges, hey, what's the worst thing that can happen? Right? But more importantly, it was also that, I think something that my mom always said, and since then I've heard a lot of people tell me that their parents said something similar, which is you can do anything, right? Anything you want, you can get it done. And I think it was that idea that why not? All these other idiots out of MIT are starting companies. Why not you and I? So I started a company, became an entrepreneur. We built that company for 4 years. We had 2 businesses. It was an advanced materials business for automotive and biomedical devices. The automotive side of it was acquired by Corning. So we licensed all the IP there. We spun out the biomedical device company. And at that point, a lot of VCs started calling. They knew that I was leaving GO2 at some point. I wasn't going to move to upstate New York. And I thought this would be a nice diversion for a few months to figure out what's next. I wanted to be a serial entrepreneur. And VC says, several VCs, West Coast and East Coast, said, why don't you join us and figure out what you want to do next? In the meantime, help us make investment decisions. 12 years later, here I am. I'm still still trying to figure this out. And I think what I discovered very early on was that, as Peter Thiel likes to say, 0 to 1. I like that 0 to 1 stage. I like that creation stage, the sausage making that goes on behind the scenes, the dealing with the uncertainties and unfamiliar territories. So I became easy to help entrepreneurs navigate those choppy waters and create resourcefulness around themselves. And that's what I like to do still. I love early stage startups for that reason.
And you're right that you look at it from the outside and it's very glamorous. But one of the reasons that I wrote the book is I really wanted to demystify that and just share very openly and authentically about how much of a roller coaster ride it is and all the emotions that are involved. I mean, yes, there's joy, and sometimes you feel you're on top of the world, but a lot of times it's an existential threat, and it's very stressful, and it's there's a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, a lot of unknowns and uncertainties. And I think it's important to acknowledge that because, again, like, we're role models. And if people are looking at us and thinking, oh, if she can do it or if he can do it, I can too. I think it's important to be honest.
Have you ever noticed that the earliest investors in a startup are called angels? Why are they called? Mm-hmm. Right, we just take it for granted. I raised an angel round in my company. Or why that word? I mean, startups are not exactly known to be sort of religious entities. Why did we choose that name? And I think it's because of all you said, that the fear, the anxiety, yes, we believe that, fail early, fail fast. And, one of the reasons why startups do well is because, there's no risk of failure. And if you fail, you learn from it, start another one. That said, personally, there's tremendous anguish, right? I don't take that away. Like, when startups don't work, when they fail, there's a little bit of, it hurts personally. Disappointment, for many of us, we never had that disappointment, right? We did great in school. We got great grades and trophies and all that stuff. And then you do your first startup and bang, you fall on your head and it fails and you've lost money. I think angels, is a really interesting, not just a word, but a role they play, right? They're really investing in you. They're sort of not just taking you under their wings, but they're really telling you, go forth and fly. Like, we got your back. Right? Go try it. Right? If you don't try, then we won't push forward and we won't get to the next stage. And I think it's really, really important that we look at startups that way. I think it's amazing that, America is thriving because of an industry where maybe 7 out of 10 startups fail. Like 70% chance that anything you and I start or Mark Zuckerberg starts could fail. Right? Like, we're seeing live, like, how many billionaires who've been so successful in their previous startups fail abjectly. It's like complete failures in their second and third startups. But that's okay. I think failure is fine. And providing that comfort zone, that failure is okay, is so, so important. Like, so much of discussion around venture capital and startups tends to be about how to pitch and how do you get some money out of VCs and how do you get advice and how do you get money from the Sequoias of the world or the Luxes of the world. But I think there's more to be said around, finding the right partners and finding the right people who can support you. More than money. Yeah, I think money in our industry is a commodity, right? Like, I get paid to give money to people. It's like a bank, right? Like, you're there so that people can get money. But what differentiates one bank from the other is not the money. It's it's sometimes just the warm cookies they might serve when you. But really, it's a big role that I think the investors and supporters, early supporters, play to keep this engine running. And this is, by the way, when we go back to our communities, whether it's the Pakistani American community or Pakistanis in Pakistan or Egyptians, this is the message that we bring to them, right? Like, it's not about how to raise money. It's about how do you build an ecosystem that thrives. There's a reason why Silicon Valley is what Silicon Valley is, where Boston, New York, Denver, Austin, there are a few tech centers. It's not because they're better universities. I think they're great universities elsewhere, right? Caltech is a great university. Carnegie Mellon is a great university, but that doesn't mean that there's this thriving startup ecosystem necessarily there. I think it is because the other components that support the startup ecosystem are there. And I think a lot about, immigrant communities building those, and also immigrant communities taking those lessons back to the countries that they still have family in, and encouraging others to do the same thing.
It was so fascinating to hear Dr. Zuberi's personal journey and how he discussed the importance of being a role model, being honest, and giving back. Once again, these are just 3 of many amazing guests. A couple of others, for example, included Adam Shayer, co-founder and VP of Engineering of Viv and Siri, and Daniel Gilbert, Harvard University professor of psychology. He was also a serial TED Conferences talker and author of Stumping on Happiness, another great book. So for the full recordings and even more guests, please check out Rana's LinkedIn and Facebook pages to see the latest interviews and to visit the Girl Decoded virtual book tour playlist on YouTube to see and listen to all of the featured guests. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe to Affectiva's Human-Centric AI podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts for new episodes. We are also on social media, so please reach out to us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Affectiva to share any feedback you have on the show and weigh in on the discussion using hashtag AffectivaAsks. Don't forget to rate us and comment with your feedback to help make the podcast more discoverable for others. Until next time, thanks for listening.